Welcome to another episode of Fabitgarage. So, in this episode, hopefully we're gonna fix and change everything that we noticed on the test drive last week. So, I want to show you guys the finished product installed. So the sway bar drop is looking good, lines up perfect. So if I was, the sway bar will actually move forward some. It'll actually move forward until it touches the hose. But the reason why I dropped it back is so that the sway bar link is not stretched out at its max. So it's still somewhat pointed up. And so I have plenty of room here away from the hose. This won't be blocking the harmonic balancer or anything. It's kind of tucked in out of the way. So worked out really good. Welded all around. I was gonna do plates, 2 pieces of plate on the sides, but honestly, this is welded completely all around. And I think this is plenty strong enough, especially going on a thin piece like that. So I sprayed some of that wax stuff to prevent rust on top of the threads and stuff. So I honestly came out decent. Again, I would rather have a piece not look pretty and function than have something look nice and pretty, very small welds, and then have it fail. So if I make something, I like to make a little beefier than required if I can. So these came out pretty cool. So this is fully mounted, fully bolted down, fully torqued down, and came out pretty good. So the other concern was the fans. So that's what I'm gonna start working on. And now I was gonna move the red fans on the back, reverse the blade, and make them into puller fans instead of pusher. But then I was on my lunch break and I stumbled across this. 2 Lite fans that are pretty much very similar in size that I need. They're actually, if you look on the fan on the other side, they're actually Spall fans, which is top of the line brand. But I don't know if the Lite is just the housing or Lite did some kind of work with Spall. I'm not sure, but either way, these 2 brands are the top quality for fans. That's the go-to for most people. So this actually came with a nice little low-profile shroud. So it's pretty thin. I plug it in. This is used, obviously. I plugged it in. This thing moves a ton more air than those little red fans. So if I can make these work, if I have to trim it a little bit, it is slightly wider, but if I can trim the sides a little bit and make these work, these are gonna move a ton of air. So I'm actually gonna try and put these on the back here. Don't know if I'm gonna have room. The water pump is pretty close. Less case if I really have to, I can move the radiator a tiny bit more in, but I would rather not, because that's going to be a whole nother project. So if I can sneak that fan in here. But again, I could have went out and bought brand new fans, but this is a budget, so I'm always online trying to find deals on parts, because after all, this is a budget build. So I actually picked this up for $40, which is a steal. And the kid who sold it to me listed as a 300ZX fan, and I met with him after work to go pick it up, and before I even got there, he messaged me. He's like, "Oh, I also have a V8 swap," because he happened to see the V8 swap on my Facebook page. So I got to his house, and he had a 300ZX with a LS swap, which was pretty cool. Very clean car. He did very good work. You can tell under the hood, like, he did everything nice. And like a lot of people do swaps and they have wiring laying out everywhere, and it just doesn't look clean. So he did a very good job with his car, and he gave me a really good deal on the fan. I appreciate it. And we got to talking and stuff. So really good kid. So if you're watching this, I appreciate you for selling me these for good price and helping me out in the build. So yeah, let me get playing with these fans and see what I can come up with. But if I can plug those 2 fans in, I should most likely not worry about overheating, because they move a lot of air. I don't know what CFM they are, but they move a lot more air than these little fans here. So All right, guys, let's get going. Okay, so I'm gonna start working on the fans. I think I came up with a plan. So as you can see, I don't have much room between my water pump pulley and my radiator. Now, let me get you the fan. So fortunately, this is actually pretty low right here where the pump pulley would sit. It actually caves down, so it gives me actually pretty good clearance. So the bulkier section of the fan is actually the fan motor itself, which I have room for here. My problem is in the middle, so this shroud actually works perfect. So my plan is I'm gonna cut here, and I'm gonna trim this piece here off pretty close to the stud, so I can still keep the stud there for the mount. And then I'm gonna take the radiator that's facing straight up, and I'm gonna tilt it probably another 1/4 inch, 1/2 inch this way. And what that's gonna do, that's gonna give me 1/4 inch, 1/2 inch here. So picture this is standing like tears. I'm gonna cut the front. This is gonna move forward, and it'll be at a slight angle, and the shroud should be able to slide right in and have enough room, hopefully. So it's all I can do unless I want to really modify everything else. So I'm gonna give that a shot. I'm gonna cut this here and see if I can make it work. Okay, so I was able to make that 300ZX shroud work. I actually did not have to trim it at all. On the sides, the actual dimensions is the same. All I had to do was trim around, let me focus here, trim around the hoses and around, on the other side, around the Miata mounting holes for the factory fan. So I just made 2 brackets. This one bolts to the radiator, this one's riveted to the shroud, and on the top I just put bolts and washers because over here it was nice and tight already. So it's not airtight, but it's close. It'll be a lot better. This will be in the back, and these fans, I believe they're 11 inches out of 10. They're a little bigger than the red fans, and these move a lot of air. I mean, I plugged one red and one of these on the front of the car, and it's like, oh my God, night and day difference. Like this one moves twice the amount of air as the red ones, and I have 2. So this is all secured. Now I'm working on the wire, and I'm adding that plug that I have on the car already. If you want to keep your harnesses thin, make sure you stagger your butt connectors. I still have to. These are heat shrink. I don't like using the regular ones that you just crimp and leave it, because moisture gets in there and it'll be all green and corroded, and the wire will just fall off over time. So these are the heat shrink ones. You crimp them, and then you use a heat gun, and there's hot glue inside of the tube that melts to the wire, and this will be pretty much watertight. And then by staggering them like this, you make sure that when you tape it up, your harness is nice and thin, because you don't have that big bulk of butt connectors in here. If you want to do 3, 4, you want to stagger them out to make sure your harness is nice and thin. So it should be all set, and then we're going to put it on the car and we're going to make it fit. So let's get going. That's how my harness came out, nice and thin, zip tied here, and my harness will come here and just plug fan 1, fan 2. That's already on the car. Looks a lot neater. So let's go put it on and make this thing fit. Okay, after a lot of work, I was able to put this in and make it fit. So what I had to do was I had to cut this section out. I cut about a little less than an inch, like 3/4 of an inch in, and went all the way across. Over here, I added some, this is like silicone vacuum line that I cut a slice into it with a razor blade, and then put it on here so you won't have a sharp edge going against the radiator. It's not really touching it. It looks like it is, but it's actually not. So the radiators actually can move a little bit. I cannot reuse the factory mounts because now this is actually a little higher up. So I ended up having to make 2 mounts here, and then I'll worry about the hood clearance when we get there. But as you guys can see in the back, I have just enough room. I mean, this shroud is just enough room. I have the 2 wires coming in here. This is the plug that I added on the car going to the fans on the front, so I just rerouted it to right here. Have fan 1, fan 2 connected. Looks nice. So this is all bolted down. Both fans are on. These fans move a ton more air than the other ones, and they're in the back. And not only that, but there's an actual shroud. Again, more silicone holes here to kind of seal it off a little bit. But now this is an actual proper setup, and I should not have any overheating issues whatsoever. And the front is nice and open, so there is no longer fans that are blocking airflow from the roll to cool it. So I should be pretty good. Not only that, my gauge came in, my Prosport gauge came in. So now I'm in the process of taking that coolant adapter that I have that goes here. I'm gonna drill and tap for an 1/8 inch national pipe thread and screw in the sender that comes with the gauge. That way I'll have the Miata gauge running off of this one, and then I'll have the aftermarket Prosport gauge running off the other sender. And I can put the gauge in the car. I'm gonna wire the gauge to one of the switches on the switch panel, so that way I can just leave it on all the time pretty much. But it's nice and convenient because the gauge is gonna be mounted right above the switches, and I already have power and ground right at the switches. So I'll just use one of the toggles to control the gauge, which turns on and off with the ignition. So if I leave the switch on all the time, as soon as I turn the key on, the gauge will come alive anyway. So yeah. So I think the radiator part of the problem we were having is all set. Just enough clearance. I kind of looked out that I got this fan because the fan and the shroud is like one piece, but it tapers down in the center. See how it tapers down and then up again? So I kind of lucked out because this is exactly where I need the most clearances in the middle. See, if this was the same height as this, it would hit the bolts. So I kind of really lucked out on finding this used set of Flex-Life fans. So I'll put it all back together. All I'm working on now is I'm going to drill and tap for the sender here. So let's get that done. All right, so I drilled a hole right next to the other sensor, but offset to the right a little bit so it won't interfere. I used the sensor that I'm going to screw into here. It's a 1/8 inch national pipe thread. So I use a 2164 drill bit, drilled it out. Now I'm going to use the tap and some cutting oil and put some threads in there for the sensor. All right, so I just use the tap, put some nice threads in there. You see? Make sure you use cutting oil. And when I put it on the vise, I put it on a rag. That way it's less chance of damaging it or putting like a burr on the side here where it goes to the hose, and you could actually damage the inside of the hose. So you do not want to add any kind of sharpness on this lip here. So now I'm just gonna screw in my sensor. Again, you do not want to use Teflon tape on your sensor because you want the threads on the sensor to ground to this housing here. So what I do is I basically 3/4 up on the threads. I leave it just threads. And on the last quarter, I usually put a bead of silicone around it. So that way when I tighten it down, by the time it gets to the silicone, it'll be nice and sealed. And at the same time, you're getting the ground through your threads. So let's put the sensor in and put it back on the car. All right, so the new sensor is down there, as you can see. Has a nice pigtail with a plug, very high quality. It's not some universal sensor. Looks like the sensor is high quality. The harness is nice and high quality. So this is gonna plug in here. I have the other piece inside the car that I'm running right now. So as you can see, this goes right into the harness grommet. This is the side that's gonna plug into the sensor over here. So I gotta run the wire, run it inside the car to the gauge. So I still have to fill up the cooling system and bleed for a second time because I just had the whole cooling system apart. But I did take out the vent here where I'm gonna do my temperature gauge, and it just so happens that once you remove this ball in there, it's the perfect size for the gauge. it goes in snug and stays there. So all I have to do is slide this in after I wire it, and I have my gauge right there. Okay, so I have the wire running all the way to the temperature sensor down here. So that's going to be for the digital gauge. That's going to be for the Miata gauge stock. So it's all in the car. I'll show you how it came out. Actually pretty cool. So that's how it is. If you're sitting on the driver's seat, right there. So I'll turn it on for you guys to see. So the only thing that's not going to work right on the switches here. So what I did was the first one is for the gauge. And when I turn it on, this gauge comes on. So it's basically just turning the key on. So I'm going to leave it on all the time. So every time I turn the key on, the switch is already on. That gauge comes on. And that's showing 83 degrees because there's no coolant in the car right now. And that's probably what it would be anyway, because it's about exactly 83, 84 degrees. So once I put coolant in it and start it up, you're going to see that go 84, 85, all the way up to 180 when the thermostat opens. And then I'll be able to really monitor the temperature. And then I can go here and I can select peak and I can have it change colors. I will leave it on white. And I can actually select the temperature for it to warn me. So it's kind of cool. If I shut this off, it shuts the gauge off. I'll leave that on all the time. So it came out pretty cool. I'll be able to truly trust that. I also wired a fan, so when I flip this up, you can hear the fans running. Flip it off. So the only thing that does not work here is this light, because the way my fan turns on is by giving it ground, not power. So this is hooked up to the gauge, and when I flip this on, it gives the gauge power. I cannot use the switch to give ground without disabling the LED, because I have to reverse power and ground for it to give it ground instead of to give it power. And LEDs are, they have a polarity, so you can only put power to LED one way. If you put it the other way, nothing really will happen, but it's not gonna light up. So it'll still work, it's just not gonna light up. And I'm okay with that, because that's kind of a emergency only switch. So yeah, the gauge is working. I can fill it up with coolant. I can bleed the system and take it for a drive, and it should be a lot cooler, and I should have no coolant issues whatsoever. So that's pretty much gonna wrap up this week's episode. I'd say we did okay fixing the little bugs and things we found on the last test drive. So for next week's video, I'm gonna modify the shifter again and probably rebuild it, because you can see there's a little bit of slop up and down and side to side, and there's a little cup that goes there. They call it like a shifting bushing, and I think that was reused, so I ordered a new one. I'm gonna drop it in, modify this so it's a little higher, fix the pattern on the shifter, and then I can put this whole center console back together. So then another thing I gotta do is I gotta remove the LED bulb, because that's for the immobilizer for the key, and I don't really have that anymore because I'm not running an engine computer. So I'm just gonna remove that bulb so that stops flashing. Battery light works. If the alternator craps out, that battery light will come on the way it's wired. So fuel gauge works. The only thing that don't work is the speedometer and tachometer, which I have to buy a converter box to make them work. So that's going to be later down the line once the car is actually on a good standing point, you know, running and driving and registered. So yeah, appreciate you guys watching, and stay tuned for the next week's episode and see what we're going to do next. Take care, guys.